The year is 1914, on a small island where there is no city, no crowd of people, only a lighthouse and a mystery hidden deep in the ocean. The film begins with a ship moving toward its destination through the South Atlantic Ocean. On that ship was a weather officer named David. They were heading to an island hidden in the deepest parts of the Atlantic Ocean. The government had sent David there to observe the changing weather of the island. David was supposed to stay there for about a year, collecting data to understand the strange weather changes, and then return. The captain was taking David to that island on his ship, along with a year's worth of food and all the necessary supplies. After a long journey, they finally reached the island. Using a boat, they came ashore and brought along their essential belongings. There was a lighthouse on the island and a small house where David was supposed to stay because a weather officer had previously lived there, but now his duty was over. From today, David became the new weather officer of this island, and the old officer, Robert, was about to return home with Captain Axel's ship. But when they went to the house, they were shocked. There was no sign of any human presence. The furniture was scattered around, and everything was in disarray. Maybe someone was in the lighthouse. Captain and David, without wasting any time, moved toward the lighthouse and saw a strange sight. The whole lighthouse was surrounded by sharp wooden spikes, as if someone had deliberately sealed it so that no one could enter. Captain and David knocked on the gate several times, but there was no response. Eventually, they pushed the gate hard and went inside. Right at the top of the lighthouse, they found a man named Gruner lying down. When they asked Gruner about the old weather officer, he answered quite carelessly. He died. He had some terrible disease. When the captain asked him about the dead body, his response was even stranger. Maybe someone killed him. Hearing Gruner's words, David and the captain were both shocked. They thought maybe Gruner's mental condition wasn't okay, but until they found out what happened to the old officer, they couldn't do much. The captain told David, "If you still want, you can come back with us." But David knew that if he could give the government an accurate weather report from this island, he could earn a lot of money, and he needed that money badly. So he decided he would stay. The captain gave him a gun for protection. Maybe this place wasn't as safe as it looked. After the captain left, David settled into the house, making it livable. In one of the drawers, he found a diary belonging to the old officer. That officer had arrived on this island in 1913. The diary had a lot written about the island, but not everything was clear. Some parts were incomplete. David kept reading every line carefully. There were also some sketches of strange animals in the diary. David didn't understand why he had drawn such pictures. Maybe he was lonely and did it to pass the time. On one page of the diary, there was also a photo of his wife. David got tired of reading the diary and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, David began his work, but as he approached the shore, his steps stopped. Between the rocks, some stones were arranged in a strange way, with some seashells placed among them in a peculiar pattern. David thought maybe Gruner had done this. Thinking that, he got back to work, collecting weather data, the very job he had come here for. During his work, when he looked at the lighthouse through his binoculars, he saw another person with Gruner. But then he thought it must be his imagination. Night had fallen, and David was busy with his work when there was a knock on the door. He thought maybe it was Gruner. David called out his name, but there was no response. Holding a lamp in his hand, as David moved forward, he began to hear some strange sounds in his ears. Then he saw a bizarre creature's hand trying to come in through the gap under the gate. That hand wasn't human. David's heart filled with terror, and he immediately ran to the basement and hid there. In a little while, the mysterious creature entered the house. It was searching for David, peeking around in the dark. Through a small crack in the basement, the creature's terrifying eyes stared directly at David. David grabbed a knife, and as soon as the eyes appeared in front of that crack, he stabbed with all his strength. The creature screamed and ran away, but it could come back at any time. David securely closed the basement door, tied it tightly with rope, and spent the entire night awake in the shadow of fear. The next morning, when David went outside, he saw some marks on the sand. The footprints didn't look human at all. It was clear that this wasn't the work of a human. Those footprints ended straight at the ocean's edge. Now David understood everything. Why Gruner had put sharp wooden spikes around the lighthouse. Probably for that same strange creature. And now David knew this house wasn't safe for him at all. That creature would probably come back again tonight. Terrified, David ran to the lighthouse, shouting for Gruner to open the gate and let him in. But Gruner didn't let him in and said, "You should have left with that ship." David, disappointed, returned to his house. But now he had to make his house safe. He boarded up every window with wooden planks, surrounded the house with sharp wooden stakes, and outside the gate, he placed old papers and books, then poured oil over them. If the creature came back, he could use fire to scare it away. But there was one thing David still didn't know, and tonight he was about to find out. By luck, he found an old box inside the house. In that box was a gun and many bullets. Seeing this gave him a bit of courage, but the fear was still alive. As the sun set and night's darkness spread everywhere, David sat quietly in a corner of the house, clutching the gun. His breaths were fast. Then a strange sound was heard, and as David took steps toward the window, it felt like the ground had slipped from under his feet. There wasn't just one. Rising from the water, there were many of those same bizarre creatures, and they were all heading toward his house. In no time, they began trying to break down the gate. David immediately started firing. Some creatures fell, but the rest became even more violent. They were now trying to force their way inside the house. As their numbers grew, David wasted no time and set fire to the old papers and books he had left outside the gate. Seeing the fire, the creatures, frightened, retreated back into the ocean. But now that same fire had reached David's house. The house caught fire, and because it was made entirely of wood, the flames spread like lightning. David quickly wrapped himself in a sheet to protect himself, broke through the gate, and ran outside, hiding behind a big rock near the lighthouse. His right hand was badly burned. Fortunately, it started raining at that moment. The fire slowly began to die down. But even after a night of heavy rain, by morning, David couldn't save his house. It had almost entirely burned to ashes. Now, if David wanted to stay alive, he had to take refuge in the lighthouse. He picked up his rifle and hid among the rocks near the lighthouse. When Gruner stepped out of the lighthouse to fill water, David quietly followed him. His plan was to hold Gruner at gunpoint and force him to let him inside the lighthouse. But suddenly, when Gruner pointed a gun at him, a strange creature, which was right next to Gruner, attacked him. That creature was Gruner's protector. Gruner immediately stopped David and said, "This is my pet." David didn't fire, but he made one condition clear. If he wanted to stay alive, he had to be allowed to live in the lighthouse. He had enough gunpowder for a year and enough food for both of them to survive. Gruner stayed silent for a while and then slowly agreed. Before evening, the two of them took the remaining food and returned to the lighthouse. The next morning, that creature quietly licked David's hand while he was in a deep sleep, and in a short time, his hand was mostly healed. It was a shock for David, but it was hard to deny what he was seeing right in front of his eyes. From the top of the lighthouse, David saw Gruner counting the bullets they had left from the gun, and that creature was also helping Gruner in its own way. This meant that this animal wasn't violent. David now wanted to know more about it from Gruner, and he wanted to bring all this in front of the world because this was nothing short of a miracle. A strange female creature from the deep dark waters of the sea stood before them. If the truth about this creature came out, both David and Gruner would become world famous. But Gruner didn't want any of this. He didn't want to leave this island at all. Gruner had no one of his own. According to him, no one in society could truly be alone. Everyone had to be someone's slave or servant. That's why this island was perfect for him, a place where he considered himself a king, the master of his own will. That's why he had written in many places across the island, "Gruner is king." But how did that strange female creature become his pet? Actually, once Gruner had saved her life. She had accidentally gotten caught in his fishing net. At that time, she was small, and from that day onwards, she started living with Gruner, obeying his every command. But Gruner was an angry man, and he never behaved with her like a human. He regularly had physical relations with her. Once, that creature even attacked Gruner, and in return, Gruner punished her, such a punishment that after it, that creature began to think of herself as Gruner's maid. Maybe that's why every night those creatures from the sea came out to take her back. But those creatures couldn't attack in daylight. Anyway, David didn't want to stay here anymore. He wanted to send a signal to any passing ship and leave this place. But this task wasn't that easy. Gruner said that no ship ever came near this island. But David didn't believe him. He didn't like being here at all now. He felt suffocated and wanted to leave as soon as possible. Evening came, and Gruner told him, "Get your gun ready because those creatures can attack at any time." They got ready to turn on the lighthouse light, and soon enough, a large number of creatures emerged from the sea and started advancing toward the lighthouse. Gruner kept firing at them continuously, but David was completely terrified. He started backing into the lighthouse. Despite Gruner telling him repeatedly to fight, he just sat quietly in a corner, and soon David fainted. Gruner kept fighting those creatures alone. The next morning, Gruner angrily woke him up and said, "If you want to stay in the lighthouse, you'll have to obey my every command. Fetch water every day, do all the small and big chores of the lighthouse, and give guard duty at night with me." Whether David wanted to or not, he had no choice. To stay alive, he had to stay in the lighthouse. David was now ready to do all of Gruner's chores, but there was one thing he never liked: watching Gruner physically torture that female creature in different ways every day. But anyone who has lived alone on this deserted island for years would have their mental state a bit disturbed. David thought maybe Gruner's mind was no longer normal. But still, he had to obey him. Night fell again. They both got ready for guard duty once more, and again those creatures came out of the sea. But tonight, David wasn't scared. He fired at them, but today Gruner did nothing. He locked David outside the lighthouse gate and quietly sat inside. He wanted David to learn for himself how to fight those creatures, otherwise he'd die fighting them. David screamed for help, but Gruner didn't help him. That's how the night passed, fighting and struggling, and morning came. In the morning, Gruner saw David sitting outside the lighthouse gate, covered in blood. He had now learned how to fight those creatures. The fear inside him was gone. Time kept passing, nights of fighting those creatures and days spent managing the lighthouse work for Gruner. This island now felt like a locked house to David. He kept thinking about when he'd leave this place, when he'd be free. With time, David formed a strange friendship with that female creature. David started feeling bad for her. Now he understood how hard it was to live alone, separated from your own kind. Maybe that creature felt the same. David even gave her a name, Anarus. Then one day, they noticed that the attacks from those creatures were slowly decreasing. David thought maybe in winter they went somewhere else, like whales do, or maybe they had realized that fighting these two wouldn't get them anything. But Gruner made it clear, no, they would attack again. Now they were reproducing, and their numbers were increasing. Some more days passed like this. One night, after dinner, Gruner and David started playing chess to pass the time. But there, Gruner made a big mistake. Both of them got so lost in the game that they completely forgot to turn on the lighthouse lights. Taking advantage of the darkness, the creatures attacked them. David saw that those creatures had now bred. They were so many that even two people together couldn't fight them for long. The bullets from their guns were almost finished too. Somehow, dodging and hiding, they reached the top of the lighthouse. But in the process, Gruner's leg got deeply wounded. The creatures were trying to break into the lighthouse, and David and Gruner couldn't see any way out. They had given up. But fortunately, morning arrived. As soon as the sun slowly rose, those creatures left the lighthouse and went back into the sea. Anarus tried to heal Gruner's wound, but by now David understood that they could never win this fight against those creatures. The bullets were almost gone, and they didn't have enough food to last much longer. The next day, fortunately, while David was wandering around outside the lighthouse, he saw a ship in the sea. He quickly went inside, grabbed the flare gun, and went to signal the ship. But Gruner stopped him because he didn't want David to leave this place. At that moment, Anarus attacked Gruner. She wanted to save David from Gruner. Gruner didn't want to let anyone leave this island. This island was his own world where he lived like a king. He had a servant who obeyed his every word, and he didn't want to leave this life and go back to the city. And he didn't want David to leave either. After so much time alone, he finally had someone he could talk to. Slowly, that ship disappeared into the sea before David's eyes. Now he had nothing left to do. A few more days passed in this way. Gruner was still behaving badly with both David and Anarus, but he especially beat up Anarus, which David didn't like at all. One day, David gifted Anarus a small toy boat he had made from whale bones, hoping that it might make her feel a bit better. But when Anarus saw the boat, she took David to a corner of the island where there was an actual boat hidden. When David asked Gruner about this boat, he said that yes, he already knew that there was a boat in that part of the island. A few months ago, an arms smuggling ship carrying a large cache of ammunition had sunk near this island because of a storm in the sea. Some of the people on that ship managed to reach the island alive through the boat, but before the morning, none of them survived. They had all fallen prey to those creatures. Hearing all this, an idea formed in David's mind. They had something like a diving suit. If someone among them wore that suit and dived into the part of the sea where the ship had sunk, maybe they could find some bullets or dynamite, which would make it easier to fight those monsters. But Gruner flatly refused. He didn't even want to go near that part of the sea. However, David was ready to do this task even if it meant risking his life. A few more days passed like this. A deep connection started to develop between David and Anarus. David had begun to like her. Gruner noticed this quietly, and for the first time, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe he should help David. But Gruner's real intention was something else. He wanted David to bring the dynamite boxes from the bottom of the sea to the surface with his help, and then he planned to leave David alone in the sea so that the creatures would kill him. This way, the dynamite would be his, and Anarus would again become his slave. They both reached that place. David put on the diving suit and went down into the sea. The ship was completely destroyed, but luck was on their side. They found some boxes of dynamite. Suddenly, those creatures appeared in front of David. He panicked and fell. The iron diving suit was so heavy that he couldn't even move. He couldn't even send a signal to Gruner above. Gruner thought the creatures had probably killed David, but in reality, there were only two small children there. David created pressure underwater and left the diving suit behind. He swam up to the surface on his own. They found some old boxes there, which contained dynamite. They placed the dynamite in 2 layers around the lighthouse so that when the next attack came, they could finish off the monsters in one blow. A few months passed, and snow started to fall. But once again, those creatures disappeared. The attacks had stopped. Now their main job was to keep the lighthouse running and keep watch as usual. Gruner's patience was broken. He suspected that Anarus had told those monsters about the dynamite plan, which was why they were not attacking now. Gruner went crazy with anger and started beating Anarus, but David stopped him. In the end, the two of them came up with a new plan, to leave the main gate of the lighthouse open so that as soon as the creatures came close, they could blow them up with dynamite. Soon after, those creatures started emerging from the sea again. They headed straight for the main gate, and as soon as they entered, they attacked David. David showed courage and fought back against the monsters. As soon as the creatures reached the lighthouse, Gruner pressed the dynamite lever. But the blast didn't happen. David had disconnected its connection, and he had forgotten to reconnect it. David immediately ran upstairs and started reconnecting the dynamite wires. By that time, the creatures were trying to climb the lighthouse, and Gruner was the only one trying to stop them. As soon as the connection was complete, David detonated the first layer. Many of the creatures were destroyed in the blast, but there were still plenty of monsters ready to attack the lighthouse. So Gruner detonated the second layer as well. Both of them were knocked unconscious by the horrific explosion. The next morning, when they regained consciousness, Anarus was not there. Dead creatures were scattered all around. Gruner was killing any that were still alive but injured. At that moment, David noticed a necklace hanging from the neck of one of the creatures. In that moment, he realized his biggest mistake. The creatures he had always thought of as violent were actually civilized like humans. They just couldn't speak. Perhaps their attack on the lighthouse had a reason behind it. But for Gruner, all of this was useless. For him, he was the king of this island, and everyone had to obey his orders. After that day, those creatures were never able to attack the same way again. But every day, from the edge of the sea, a crying voice would come. David still didn't know how much damage he had caused, how many families had been broken, how many children had lost their loved ones, all because of one misunderstanding. The next day, David saw some of those creatures' small children in the sea, the ones who had lost their families. David made a round circle of stones and placed that small toy boat in the middle, hoping Anarus would return. But no matter how long he waited, Anarus never came back. One morning, David saw Gruner lying unconscious. Around him were some old things, including an old photograph. As soon as David looked at that picture, he was shocked. The woman whose photo he had seen in Gruner's diary on the first day was none other than his wife. Gruner had a wife, and he was the weather officer of this lighthouse, who had arrived on this island about a year ago. His real name was Robert, but he had changed his name because now he never wanted to leave this island. Seeing all this, David also gave up hope that he would ever be able to leave this island. The next evening, when David went to the seashore, he saw that the small boat that was kept in that circle was no longer there. But in the same place, he saw a small child of a creature holding that boat in its hands. David threw his torch in the middle of the circle to show that he had no intention of fighting. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He wanted to befriend them. After a little while, Anarias emerged from the sea waves, and behind her, an entire group of creatures also emerged from the sea. But this time, none of them attacked David because they too now wanted peace. Their intention was just to find a safe place for their children, just like any other animal would do. They didn't like the sudden entry of humans on this island at all. That's why they attacked every night. But who would explain this to Gruner? He still considered himself the king of this island. Gruner came out of the lighthouse holding a gun in his hand. David tried to explain to him that these creatures don't want to fight. They want peace. But Gruner didn't listen to anyone. He screamed at Anarias to go inside. But for the first time, Anarias didn't obey him because now she was no longer his maid. Now she was just a mother standing up for her children. Gruner began to feel weak inside because now no one was obeying his orders. In anger, he moved towards the lighthouse. David thought that perhaps Gruner had finally understood that every animal wants freedom. No one wants to live as someone's slave. But Gruner was not a sensible man. As soon as he reached the lighthouse, he fired a flare from the signal gun, which went straight and hit the child of a small creature. That child died immediately. All the creatures ran away out of fear, and Anarias also lost all her trust in David. Mad with anger, David immediately ran towards the lighthouse and collided with Gruner, started fighting with him. Why did you do all this? These people only wanted peace. But Gruner had become so violent that he decided to kill David. Holding an axe in his hand, just as he was about to strike David, David called him by his real name, Robert. Hearing this, Gruner suddenly stopped. In reality, Robert was never such a person. After coming to this island, his mental state had almost completely broken down. Loneliness, the death of his wife, and deep depression, all these had made him like this. In truth, he was not a killer. He was a good man. Those creatures never wanted to fight. They only wanted peace. Gruner killed them just to show himself as powerful. And now, Gruner had realized his mistake. That's why he surrendered himself in front of those creatures. And in just a few moments, they killed him. David locked himself inside the lighthouse. Time continued to pass just like that, and a year later, a government officer arrived on the island with a new weather officer. David was taken away from there, and now the new government officer started monitoring the weather on this island. But that officer thought that David was Gruner, and David didn't correct this misunderstanding of theirs. He quietly went and stood on the balcony without saying anything because now he too didn't want to leave this island, just like Gruner. Meanwhile, Anarias was happy with her family. Now they didn't have to fear any man like Gruner. Now they could live freely on the island and in the sea.